Today we're out here taking a look at the 2017 Cadillac XT5. The XT5 replaces the Cadillac SRX as Cadillac's mid-size two-row crossover. The important thing to remember about the XT5 is that very much like the SRX that it replaced, the Lincoln MKX, and the Lexus RX, this is not exactly a direct competitor to the BMW X3 or the Audi Q5. That's because the X3, the Q5, the GLC, the XC60, etc. are all compact two-row crossovers, and this is, as I said, a mid-size two-row crossover. The XT5, like the SRX, also uses a transverse engine layout up front. That means this starts out as a front-wheel drive car, although we are driving the all-wheel drive version. That's a little bit different than the average European entry, which starts out as a rear-wheel drive car with all-wheel drive optional. It's also quite different than Cadillac's sedan lineup, which is predominantly rear-wheel drive. The front-end design is a refinement of what we see in the rest of the Cadillac lineup, and it's a little bit closer to the Cadillac CT6 than the ATS or CTS. We still have the strong angular lines that we've come to expect from Cadillac, and we have this LED daytime running lamp strip that runs from the bottom of the bumper right up over here to the front fender. Our model has the optional full LED headlamps. Halogen lamps are standard, but the top two trims do get these LEDs. At 189.5 inches long, this is just about the same size as the Lincoln MKX. It's actually 3 inches shorter than the new Lexus RX. When you compare the XT5 outside of this relatively small subcategory, this is obviously closer in size to the BMW X5 than the BMW X3. In addition to being longer overall than something like a BMW X3, we have a very different proportion up front because we have a shorter hood and the front tire is pushed a little bit closer to the rest of the body. That's again because the X3 is a rear-wheel drive based vehicle. This is a front-wheel drive based vehicle. And that means that we actually get more efficient packaging inside the cabin than you find in the average rear-wheel drive vehicle. And it's really obvious when you take a look at the rear seat legroom, because we have just about 4 inches more rear seat legroom in this than something like the BMW X3 or the Mercedes or Audi competition. Although we do expect Cadillac to bring us a three-row crossover at some time, it's very obvious when you take a look at this portion of the vehicle that this is a two-row crossover. It's very trendy right now to give you this steeply raked rear glass. On the downside, it means that we get a slightly less practical cargo area. Out back we find very similar styling cues to the rest of the Cadillac lineup, but I think that the rear end of the vehicle is not quite as well designed as the front end of the vehicle. I'd like to know what you think about it down there in the comments section down below. We have these very classic Cadillac tail lamps that rise from the vehicle right here and actually have a very slight bump on top, sort of like a proto fin, and they wrap on towards the rear fender. Stainless steel bumper right down here and a tow hitch receiver covered by that section if you do opt for it. Although there is a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine available in this vehicle in other world markets, in the United States we get just this 3.6-liter V6 engine. But this is not the same 3.6 that we saw in the Cadillac SRX. This is actually a new V6 for GM. Producing 310 horsepower and 271 pound-feet of torque, this engine features all of the latest engine technologies. We have start-stop, we have cylinder deactivation, so this can run as a 4-cylinder vehicle if it wants to, and direct injection. All those new features, combined with a brand new 8-speed automatic transmission from Aisin, allow this vehicle to average 21 to 22 miles per gallon in the EPA 2017 cycle. That's fairly good for a vehicle of this size with this kind of horsepower under the hood. Thanks to the cylinder deactivation system especially, this vehicle does very well in steady-state highway driving. If you get the front-wheel drive model, you'll average 27 miles per gallon in highway driving according to the EPA, but in real-world driving you may actually get higher fuel economy than that. Maximum towing capacity in the XT5 is 3,500 pounds. You'll notice that is a little bit lower than some of the other two-row crossovers we see out there, and something like a BMW X5, which is available as a two-row vehicle that's about the same size, or as a three-row vehicle. Front seat comfort ranges between 7 out of 10 points in the base model and 8 out of 10 points in this top-end trim. We are in the model that has the optional extending thigh cushion. That's a manual extension. We also have the optional two-way adjustable lumbar support. In an interesting touch, the base model of the XT5 does not get an adjustable lumbar support. Although all models do come standard with a power driver and front passenger seat and a power tilt telescopic steering column. Notably absent from the XT5 are the multiple ways of motion that we find in the brand new Cadillac CT6. We also don't get any massaging capability in these seats like we do find again in that larger Cadillac. Rear seat comfort comes in at 9 out of 10 points if you opt for the optional panoramic moonroof, 10 out of 10 points if you don't. That's because it does remove a decent amount of rear headroom. In the model that we're driving, my head does barely touch the ceiling, although I have an enormous amount of legroom compared to those smaller European entries. Again, we have about 4 inches more combined legroom than you'll find in a BMW X3. We also have just a little bit more width across the rear bench seat than many of those European entries. It's very noticeable when you scoot over to the middle seat because it's a lot easier to put 3 adults in the back of the Cadillac. Moving all the way over to the right side, this front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" person I had in the vehicle. I still have an inch of legroom left. Helping improve rear seat comfort, the rear seats also recline, and the recline mechanism is nice and low on the seat back. The front-wheel drive layout of the XT5 and the overall size increase versus the average European entry means that we find a much larger cargo area in the back. Behind the hatch, you will find just over 30 cubic feet of storage space. That's a little bit behind the Lincoln MKX, but a notable improvement over the Lexus RX. The very sloped rear profile of the Lexus RX has a direct impact on its cargo carrying capacity. That means when it came to our roller bag test, we were able to fit 6 of these 24-inch roller bags in here. You can actually fit a little bit of hand luggage as well. You can actually fit these 2 right there like that because of the XT5's width. This is another area you'll notice a big difference between the Cadillac and something like the BMW because the cargo area is considerably wider. Thanks to the generous size of this cargo area, the fact that we actually have a spare tire under the cargo area load floor, and these load rails right here that help you hold your cargo down, this area scores 9 out of 10 points in our exclusive Trunk Comfort Index. We do lose 1 point versus something like the Lincoln MKX because of the overall size. The MKX gives you about 7 cubic feet more room back here. As we take a look around the interior, keep in mind we are in the very top end trim, so we do have this panoramic moonroof. We also have the adjustable lumbar support for the driver and front passenger seats. You'll find 2-way adjustable headrests up front and height adjustable seat belts as well. The leather upholstery in our model is both heated and ventilated, and as we take a look around the cabin, you'll notice we definitely have more attention to detail inside the XT5 than we found in the SRX. The difference is perhaps most noticeable over here on the front doors, where we find more soft touch material and more stitched leather. The upper portion of the door is stitched leather, and then we actually have an Alcantara insert there, which is faux suede. Our particular model has carbon fiber trim, but of course real wood trim is available. There's also some additional metallic trim right there around the door handle. That attention to detail continues on over to the dashboard, where we find more of that metallic trim, carbon fiber, and then of course more of this faux suede and the real leather upholstery as well. In the center of the dashboard, we have a center channel speaker, we have 2 air vents, and then we have Cadillac's infotainment and navigation system known as Cadillac Q. One of the major changes between the SRX and the XT5 is that Cadillac Q now supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration. In a little bit of a change over previous Cadillac models, however, the buttons down here for the climate control are not touch buttons anymore. They're actually physical buttons behind the plastic. So you can feel the plastic give a little bit as you press the buttons. For the heated seats, ventilated seats, we have toggles for the climate control system, and of course buttons for the rest of the climate features. Below the climate controls, we have a small storage cubby that's not quite large enough to put an iPhone 7 Plus inside. We have more stitched material right down the center console. And then we find a shifter that's very similar to what we saw in the Buick LaCrosse that we reviewed recently. This is a joystick style, very similar to what we see in BMW models. If you want to put the car in drive, you press this button right over here on the side of the shifter, then you pull the control back to drive. One more pull back gives you manual mode. There's no need to press the button for that. You can actually toggle between the drive and the manual mode by just pulling back. If you want neutral, you just press forward and hold. If you want reverse, you press forward and then pull to the left. To park the vehicle, we simply press the P button, where you can actually turn the vehicle off and it will park itself. Like many European vehicles, the vehicle will also put itself into park automatically if it's in drive and you open the driver's door. However, it doesn't do it right away. It does take just a little bit, and then the vehicle applies the parking brake and puts the car in park. To the right side of the shifter, we find 2 moderately sized cup holders. These were able to accommodate large takeout drinks, but some of those large styrofoam drinks may not be able to fit. It is covered by a stitched cover. To the left of the cup holders and behind the shifter, we find a drive mode button. You'll notice we also have an all-wheel drive light because the all-wheel drive system behavior is dictated by the mode the vehicle is in. We have Tour, all-wheel drive, and Sport. In Tour mode, the vehicle actually disconnects the rear axle, so it does take a moment in order to send power from the front axle to the rear axle. You'll get a little bit of a slip and slide in snowy conditions, and then the power transfers to the rear. To avoid that, we simply press this button, move to the all-wheel drive mode. You'll notice the all-wheel drive indicator will start to blink, and then will actually stay on solid. That means the system is now connected and it's sending power 50-50 front and rear. Thanks to the design of the digital shifter, Cadillac was able to give us a storage cubby positioned sort of between the driver and front passenger's legs. Between the front seats, we have a softly padded center armrest. This opens to reveal a large storage compartment where you could put wallets, keys, that sort of thing. And then we have a wireless charger right in the front of this. To wirelessly charge your smartphone, you would actually insert your smartphone right here in this slot. As you can see, my iPhone 7 Plus inside this case just barely fits there. Of course, this phone does not have Qi wireless charging ability. You'd have to have an Android phone or a sleeve on your phone in order for that to work. I'm not sure a sleeve on this iPhone 7 would actually fit in here. Sadly, Cadillac does not offer their excellent 12-inch LCD instrument cluster in the XT5. That's the one that we see in the CT6. Instead, we have a combination instrument cluster where we have a physical tachometer and a physical speedometer over there on the right side, and then we have an 8-inch LCD that gives you everything else in the middle. The LCD is where you'll find things like your trip computer, your fuel range, instant fuel economy, tire pressure, that sort of thing, as well as navigation turn-by-turn directions. The system also offers media integration, Bluetooth phone integration, and as you can see right here, there are two different skins that we can apply to this screen. So there was the one that you saw before with the 4 dials across the top, and then we have this one that's a little bit more modern and round in theme. Moving out from there, we find the same steering wheel that we find in the Cadillac CT6 sedan. You'll find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on the left, along with a voice command button and a mute and phone hang-up button. The right side of the steering wheel is where we find the volume controls, as well as the 4-way joystick and select button for the LCD right there above the steering wheel. The bottom spokes are where you'll find things like the distance control for the radar adaptive cruise control system or the collision warning system, lane keeping assistance button, heated steering wheel button, and track forward and backward. Like Cadillac's full-size sedan, the XT5 also offers an LCD rear-view mirror. This is not a mirror you're seeing, this is actually a camera in the rear of the vehicle transmitting a signal right here to this LCD. It gives us a much wider field of view than would be possible with a traditional camera, and of course you can move it all around and it doesn't really matter where it's pointed. Something worth noting about LCD rear-view mirrors like this is that the focal distance is very different than a traditional mirror because your eyes are actually focusing right here, just about 18 to 24 inches in front of your head. That means if it takes a little bit of time for your eyes to transition from focusing on something very close up like this, or the instrument cluster in the vehicle, to something far away like objects in front of or behind you, this may be a little bit distracting compared to a traditional rearview mirror, and that's exactly why we have that traditional mirror mode. Interestingly enough, the XT5 uses essentially the same 8-speed automatic transmission as the Lexus RX 350 and as the Volvo XC90. Therefore, I had expected this to be a little bit faster to 60 than the Lexus RX 350 because we have more power under the hood. However, this actually ran from 0 to 60 a little bit slower, in 6.6 seconds versus 6.4 in the Lexus. Both the Lexus and the Cadillac are behind the twin-turbo V6 that we find in the Lincoln MKX. However, the difference is actually smaller than you might think. The reason is because the MKX still uses an older 6-speed automatic transmission, and first gear is not as deep as we find in this new 8-speed. If you want to compare the Cadillac to the European competition, this will run just about as fast or perhaps even a little bit slower to 60 than many of the 2-liter turbo engines that we find in something like a BMW X3. While acceleration lags a little bit behind the competition, braking is definitely at the top of the pack. We stopped from 60 miles an hour to 0 in 119 feet, which is very short for this category, and actually just about the same as a performance mid-size luxury sedan. The last time we drove the Lincoln MKX, which I think is probably the most direct competitor to this Cadillac, it definitely took longer to stop. Luxury versions of the Jeep Grand Cherokee will also take longer to go from 60 miles an hour back to 0. When it comes to handling, it's important to remember that the Cadillac XT5 is a more direct competitor to the RX 350, the top-end versions of the Jeep Grand Cherokee, and the Lincoln MKX than something like a BMW X3. The X3 is notably smaller than this, it's also lighter than this, and it has a more performance-oriented mission than this. Therefore, when it comes to handling, I'm going to give this a B-. This does handle better than something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee Overland. The Grand Cherokee Overland is very heavy, it also is a lot higher off the ground than this, so this is going to feel a little bit more connected to the road. The Cadillac overall is tuned a little bit softer than certain versions of the Lexus RX 350, and the all-wheel drive system is a little bit different than the other all-wheel drive systems we see in this segment. This is the only vehicle in this small group that has a torque vectoring rear axle. You won't find one in the Grand Cherokee, you won't find one in the RX or the MKX, you actually won't find one even in mainstream versions of the European competition. The torque vectoring rear axle means that this all-wheel drive system is thematically more similar to what we find in the Acura Super Handling all-wheel drive equipped vehicles, because this can send more power to the rear axle than something like an MKX or the RX 350, and it can also send 100% of the power destined for the rear axle to a single wheel. That means as we go through these curves up here under power, as we start turning to the left, it's actually going to send all the power to the right rear wheel, and now it's going to start sending the power to the left rear wheel. And that causes the vehicle to rotate more than a traditional all-wheel drive system enabled vehicle would. However, the default mode of this system is to actually disconnect that rear axle. That means that if you want the sportier torque vectoring feel and the more engaging driving nature out here on these winding mountain roads, you do have to manually select it. It's not automatic like we find in the Acura systems. The reason for that is fuel economy, because if we disconnect the rear axle, we get much better highway fuel economy especially. One thing worth noting is that you cannot control the behavior of the all-wheel drive system separately from the dynamic suspension system. That means that when we're in sport mode and it's doing the maximum torque vectoring across the rear axle, the suspension is also in its firmest mode. You can't have a more relaxed suspension nature and have that torque vectoring in the back. We do have an all-wheel drive mode, however, that attempts to split power approximately 50-50 front and rear for adverse weather situations. But again, this system is not as automatic as the competition. Since we're driving the top-end model, we also have the largest tire and wheel package available in the XT5, and that does have an impact on the ride. Thanks to the tires and wheels, we can definitely feel more of the minor road imperfections out here on this winding road than you would in the base XT5. However, generally this group of mid-sized two-row luxury crossovers is more supple than the compact two-row crossovers with which it competes. So this is going to give you a softer, more comfortable highway ride than something like a BMW X3 or the Mercedes-Benz GLC in most versions. Cadillac spent a lot of time quiet tuning this cabin, and it really shows. We scored 69.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this tied with the BMW X5 as the quietest entry in this segment. The behavior of the all-wheel drive system doesn't just affect the handling of the XT5, it also affects the fuel economy, because by disconnecting the rear axle in this vehicle, they give it an excellent highway fuel economy score. This is EPA rated for 21 miles per gallon, but we've actually been beating that slightly. We've been averaging 21.5. 21.5 may not sound very impressive when you compare this to something like a BMW X3 with the 2-liter turbo, which will get 25 miles per gallon average. However, remember, this is closer in size to the BMW X5 than the BMW X3. The XT5 is significantly more fuel efficient than the Lincoln MKX, which averages 19 miles per gallon according to the EPA score, and we averaged a little bit lower than that when we had it for a week. However, the Lexus RX 350 actually scores a little bit better than the XT5, even though it has a more traditional all-wheel drive system. My bottom line with the XT5 is that this is certainly a solid entry for a mid-size luxury crossover. This is the larger alternative, slightly softer and more comfortable alternative to something like a BMW X3, but perhaps a little bit more practical than the BMW X5. Although we have a little bit less power under the hood and we don't have a twin-turbo V6 like we find in the Lincoln MKX, that twin-turbo MKX is actually going to be only a little bit faster than this because this has an 8-speed automatic and we find an older 6-speed in the MKX. Now, if you were hoping that the torque vectoring rear axle that we find in this XT5 was sort of a thematic replacement for the first generation Cadillac SRX, which was a rear-wheel drive vehicle, then you may be a little bit disappointed. That first generation SRX was an awful lot of fun, but this is a marked improvement over the second generation SRX. As we discuss pricing and comparisons with the XT5, it's very important to again remember that it competes in a very small but unusual segment. The two closest competitors to the XT5 are the Lexus RX and the Lincoln MKX. That's because the Cadillac is a full half step larger than something like a Volvo XC60, an Audi Q5, Mercedes-Benz GLC, or the BMW X3. And yet it's not a three-row crossover like you find in the next tier up, the Audi Q7, the Volvo XC90, or perhaps the BMW X5. Although the BMW X5 is a little bit closer to the overall size of the Cadillac. In addition to that, of course, the Lexus, the Lincoln, and the Cadillac all start as front-wheel drive vehicles. You can add all-wheel drive to them, whereas the average European entry in this segment starts out as a rear-wheel drive vehicle. With that in mind, let's dive right into pricing. The XT5 starts at $39,395 for the 2017 model year. You do get the standard wood trim, Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, the 8-inch infotainment system, and the power steering column. However, as we have seen in other luxury vehicles out there, your options are limited in the base trim. You cannot get all-wheel drive, and leather is not standard. You do get leatherette seats. The least expensive XT5 with real leather upholstery is $45,295. The least expensive model with leather and all-wheel drive is nearly $48,000. If you want some of the snazzier features like the LED headlamps, ventilated front seats, and of course the self-braking system that detects pedestrians, you'll have to pay over $52,000. The Platinum model that we have been testing this week started at $62,895, which included the all-wheel drive standard. However, it actually ends up nearly $70,000 once you've added all the options that we had on ours. Although the Cadillac XT5 and the Cadillac CT6 were released around the same time as one another, they don't really have the same options and same feature sets. That means that we don't find the larger LCD infotainment system that you can get in the CT6. We also don't find the large LCD instrument cluster that we find in the Cadillac sedan. But perhaps the biggest difference is in front seat comfort, because the XT5 does not get Cadillac's new multi-way adjustable front seats with available massage, and that's something that we do find in the CT6. Let's dive right into the competition with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the Lexus RX. Although the Lexus starts about $3,000 more expensive than the Cadillac XT5, you'll actually find that comparably equipped, they're fairly close towards the bottom end of the ladder. The least expensive Lexus RX with all-wheel drive is $44,420. That's very close to the all-wheel drive price in the XT5. And if you want leather and all-wheel drive, that combination is $47,500. That means that depending on how you equip the vehicle, the Lexus could be a little bit more expensive or a little bit less expensive than the Cadillac. However, by the time you end up at the top end of the pricing ladder, you'll notice that the Cadillac becomes a decent amount more expensive than the Lexus. In fact, for the sticker price on the fully loaded Platinum model that we were testing this week, you could have bought a fully loaded Lexus RX 450 hybrid. Although the Lexus is actually a little bit heavier than the Cadillac, it feels a little bit more engaging for average driving. The Cadillac does have that torque vectoring rear axle, but you do have to engage the sport mode in order to get it. When you're in the other modes, it doesn't really have that same engaging feel. It feels very much like a front-wheel drive version of the XT5. Next up, we have the Lincoln MKX. It starts at $38,260, so that is a little bit less expensive than the Cadillac XT5, and it is probably the best deal in this very small segment. It's really noticeable when you start taking a look at the options, because $40,755 will buy you the all-wheel drive version of the MKX that is significantly less expensive than the Cadillac. If you want leather on the inside and all-wheel drive, that's about $4,000 less than the Lincoln. If you check all the option box on your MKX, you'll end up at nearly $69,000. That's not too far off the top end price of the Cadillac. However, on the Lincoln side of things, we get an awful lot more for your dollar. We get that twin-turbo V6 engine with better acceleration. We also get much more comfortable front seats. They're easily the most comfortable seats in this particular category. It's an all-new seat design for Lincoln. It's actually kind of similar to what we see in the Cadillac CT6. Available in the MKX is a 22-way adjustable seat with massage and anti-fatigue seat cushions. The MKX also manages to combine faster acceleration with a larger cargo area and a more polished ride. For some reason, a number of you on our Facebook page wanted us to talk about the Jeep Grand Cherokee, especially in the Summit trim. Now, the Jeep Grand Cherokee obviously starts less than the Cadillac XT5 at $30,395, but in the Overland trim, it starts at $44,795 for the V6 engine, and in the Summit, it starts at $50,495, and those are two-wheel drive prices. So the price points are definitely in the same ballpark. The Jeep's interior is not quite as nice as the interior that we find in the XT5, but actually for 2017, Jeep gets awfully close, because they have had for a while the full leather upper dashboard trim and upper door trim. However, for 2017, they've actually brought that leather coating all the way down to the bottom of the doors, and that replaces all the hard plastic that you find in the lower-end Jeep Grand Cherokees. Of course, ultimately, the Jeep versus Cadillac debate is a very apples to oranges comparison, because the Jeep Grand Cherokee really is after a different shopper. It's much more off-road capable than the XT5, and the XT5 is not really trying to be that kind of SUV. The next comparison you guys asked for was the XC90. It's actually an interesting competitor because the XC90 starts out as a two-row vehicle for $45,750. That's actually about the same price as a comparably equipped XT5 when you consider the value of the standard feature content that we find in each vehicle. Because the Volvo comes standard with the LED headlamps that steer in the corners, navigation software, panoramic roof, and of course leather upholstery. The big thing to keep in mind between the XC90 in its T5 trim and the XT5 is, of course, that the XC90 is going to be slower. We have less power out of that four-cylinder engine, and it's a bigger vehicle. It's nearly 6 inches longer than the Cadillac, so we have a much larger cargo area in the back, a much squarer rear passenger area. Now, oddly enough, I actually think the Volvo handles a little bit better than the Cadillac, even though we don't have a torque vectoring rear axle in the Volvo, even if you get the optional all-wheel drive system. The big reason for that is the curb weight of the Volvo and the weight balance. It actually has a weight balance that's a little bit closer to your average rear-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive vehicle than the average front-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive vehicle. Just has to do with the overall design of the XC90 and the fact that the car was designed only for that 4-cylinder engine family up front. If you get the T5 version of the XC90, it's going to be slower 0 to 60 than the Cadillac. If you get the T6 version of the XC90, it's going to be just a little bit faster than the Cadillac. Keeping in mind that the Volvo XC90 was really designed to compete with the Audi Q7, it easily gets more expensive than the Cadillac XT5. However, I would say that for the $69,000 to $70,000 price tag of a top-end XT5, you'll actually find a better interior that's more comfortable and a few more gadgets and features in the Volvo than you will in the XT5. It'll actually be a little bit more fun to drive as well. And lastly, we have the brand new Audi Q5. The Q5 is available with 2 different engines, and they straddle the performance of the XT5. So the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine in the Q5 will take you from 0 to 60 in 7 seconds. The 3-liter will take you from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. The Q5 is a very good deal for a European compact crossover. It starts just under $41,000 before destination. All-wheel drive is standard, and leather upholstery is also standard. That means that a comparably equipped Cadillac XT5 is going to be notably more expensive if you just want those 2 options. Now again, the Q5 is notably smaller than the XT5. It's actually a full 7 inches shorter because the XT5 is somewhere between the Q5 and the Q7 in overall size. It's really obvious when you take a look at the passenger area of the vehicle. We definitely find more legroom for the average driver and average passenger behind them than you'll find in the Q5. You're going to get better 0 to 60 performance out of that top-end Q5 and better handling. Now you won't get some of the top-end touches that we see in the XT5 for that price. You won't get the stitched leather dashboard, stitched leather doors, that sort of thing, but you do find a slightly higher level of refinement in some of the other controls and other touch points of the vehicle. If we roll this all the way back to the beginning, you'll remember that the Cadillac XT5 really only competes in a segment of 3. And in this segment of 3, the Lincoln MKX is my top pick, mainly because of its twin-turbo V6 engine and the very comfortable front seats, coupled with that large cargo area in the back. Obviously, fuel economy is a low point in the Lincoln, but I can forgive it for the performance of that engine and the front seat comfort. For very different reasons, the Lexus RX 450 Hybrid is my number 2 pick, primarily because of the refinement that we find in the interior, the overall seat comfort, and the fact that the fuel economy is excellent. Performance is also very good in the Lexus Hybrid. Now keep in mind with the Lexus Hybrid that the all-wheel drive system is not going to be as capable as the regular RX 350 all-wheel drive or the Cadillac or the Lincoln all-wheel drive systems because it does use that electric rear axle. We have seen Cadillac adjust the price of the XT5 just a little bit since it launched, and we have seen a few incentives on the hood. And really, I think the pricing structure of the XT5 is what keeps it from being my number 2 pick in this segment, because the interior quality is definitely where it needs to be in order to compete in this segment. And I really didn't mind the all-wheel drive system's engagement too much because you could just manually engage the sport mode. It really is the price tag of the XT5 that is a little bit of a problem for me. If you can get your dealer to take between $2,000 and $4,000 off of a brand new XT5, then I would actually put it above the Lexus in this particular category. It is an awful lot of fun to drive when you have that sport mode engaged in the vehicle. It definitely is more engaging than the MKX or the Lexus RX. And if you can get the XT5 with that much off the MSRP, it starts to become a good value as well. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Cadillac XT5. Be sure and check out those related videos on the side of your screen. Head over to patreon.com if you want to support this channel. You can also find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and I'll see you next week.